Hey everybody, I can't believe it. We made it to 100 subscribers. I'll do a separate video maybe just talking about channel updates and the like. But this is what you guys chose on the Facebook pool for the 1,000 subscriber special. I'll probably will eventually do all the other things I said for the 1,000 subscriber special. I just thought it would be a fun thing to have a poll and let people engage. So people chose to vote for a reactionary review of Les Miserables. I know that's probably not how you pronounce it, but that's how my Anglo voice pronounces it, Les Miserables. Yeah, that's what people voted for. Specifically this, with my rendition of One Day More, which I'll talk a bit more about once we get to in the story. It is awful. It is horrible. I'm tone deaf, but I just figured it would be something fun for a 1,000th episode song. I'm not expecting anyone to give me a compliment, that's for sure. So let's talk a bit about this. I'm going to tell you guys this one's going to be long. Not only because it's the 1,000th episode, but Les Miserables has always been a big part of my life. I know that sounds weird, but it's my father's favorite musical. He had the cassette tapes. He played them constantly. Whenever my sister would have a soccer game, he'd play One Day More. He'd just break out into singing it. My father has a much better voice than me. I've seen lots of different renditions of it, and this is going to be a review based on the musical and the movie. I know there's a book. I know it's based on a book. The book, though, is literally one of the longest books ever written, and I just haven't gotten around to reading it. I am looking at it, and you could easily bludgeon a man to death with the paperback of it. So it's always been part of my life. So what can we say about Les Miserables? I'm not that knowledgeable about Victor Hugo, but from my understanding, he's probably what you would consider left-wing in the 19th century. Now, left-wing back then is very different than left-wing now. And you can really see this particularly when you watch the movie version. Back in the day, social reformers were about saving prostitutes. They were about trying to get jobs and good, decent livings for underprivileged children. It was about trying to put guards on factory machines so they didn't eat people. It was kind of stuff like that. It's interesting if you actually look at a lot of the things Marx complained about. I actually agree with a lot of his kind of initial complaints about the issues during the Industrial Revolution and economic and kind of social change. That's not to say I'm a Marxist. I'm just saying you have to understand it's different than the left today. It was a lot more economic focused. I think if you talk to Victor Hugo and most people who are on the left of the 19th century about stuff like gay marriage or any of the shit we have, or trannies or whatever, they'd probably recoil in horror. So my understanding of Victor Hugo was he was on the left. He was a fan of Napoleon, although people I've read have said he was a fan of Napoleon, but he was at least some degree realistic about left-wing politics. He also was, I think you can say he was consistently a man of faith. Now, his faith was somewhat complicated. When he died, he did issue a statement in his will that he believed in God, and he asked for people to pray for peace. There were parts of his life where he was a very devout Catholic. Les Miserables certainly comes from a very devout Catholic mentality. It was actually something that kind of inspired me to convert, especially seeing the movie. But he would go through that. He'd be a deist at points in his life. I think he always, though, had a very strong moral sense and a very strong belief in the divine. At least that's my impression of Victor Hugo. So, that being the background, let's jump into the story. This is not going to be exhaustive, because this is one of the probably the greatest musical of all time. It's very deep. It's very dense. I'll probably do character profiles of a lot of the characters in it. There's a lot of very kind of philosophical and moral issues that are discussed here. So, let's just dive in. So, and I won't be able to cover everything. This is going to be very long. So, Les Miserables takes place during the July monarchy. The July, basically, for those of you who are unaware, okay, so we had the French Revolution, we had the Jacobins, and then they were overthrown by the Gordians, who became the Directorate. Then the Directorate became the Consulate, and then the consulate became the First French Empire. So the First French Empire ended with Waterloo, and there was the Bourbon Restoration, and you had a decade or two of the Bourbons back on the throne. Then there was the July Revolt, and I think it was called the Three Glorious Days, where the Bourbons were overthrown, and there's a choice between France becoming a republic again and France staying a monarchy but being under the Orleans dynasty. I believe his name was Felipe... No, what's his name again? Sorry, Louis Felipe, who was the younger brother... I believe it was... Who was the last king? Louis the 17th? Louis the 16th or Louis the 17th, whoever was the last king before the Revolution. Was the younger brother of him. And he was... The Orleanists were kind of I guess you could say, a bourgeoisie or liberal monarchy. They were very much into meritocracy, kind of Enlightenment-style freedom, free markets, capitalism, all that kind of stuff. But they were kind of not really in favor of mass democracy. They liked democracy, but they liked it only for the propertied classes. So France of the time period was very much going through kind of a transition similar to stuff like Charles Dickensian England. That's all just kind of important stuff to keep in mind in the background. I think it's pretty clear from this that Victor Hugo hated the Orleanists, and a lot of the student radicals hated them. Although, to be fair, they provided fairly effective government. So our story begins in 1815. With a group of workers singing the work song. I may just periodically break into song during this. For those of you who have heard it before, it's the one, look down, don't look him in the eye. In the movie, we're presented with Jean Valjean, our protagonist, pulling an immense, I think he's pulling like a ship or something, or he lifts like a huge beam. So we have our hero, Jean Valjean, who has been in prison for 20 years. He was put in prison for stealing a loaf of bread because during the Revolution, or is that, I think, during or just before the Revolution, when there was widespread famine, he stole a loaf of bread to feed his starving sister's son and family, and he repeatedly tried to break out of jail. So the first 5 years were for stealing the bread. The next 15 were for trying to escape. Jean Valjean is an immensely strong man. He's very kind of scraggly. I think he's early middle age at this point in time, maybe his late 30s. And he is known as Prisoner 24601. And he's released on parole after his lengthy time by the police officer Javert. And we'll talk a bit more of Javert once we come to stars and some of the scenes he is more prominent in, but he serves as the main antagonist of this movie. I say antagonist and not villain, and that'll come in clear very later. So by the law, Jean Valjean must show a yellow ticket of leave, which identifies him as being on parole. As a work, he's forced to beg, people won't let him rent a room, etc., etc. And to my understanding, this is actually somewhat, at least fairly accurate to how the legal system worked back then. People used to have much more harsh views of crime and punishment. I mean, today, if you stole a loaf of bread, that would be like petty theft. You might have to do a couple hours of community service and maybe pay like a fine of a couple $100 or something. But we today, kind of with modern psychology, etc., don't see that as like the person being a danger to society. Especially if it comes out of need, and people say, well, you should have worked for the bread. Well, this was a time of starvation and deprivation in France. He didn't even steal it during the Napoleonic era when things started to work out. So we have kind of a man who could have been decent, whose life was kind of ruined by an unfairly long jail term. And then he's incapable of correcting his life when he gets out of jail. So he's basically lying on the streets, and the a bishop finds him and offers him food and shelter. So the bishop dines with him, the bishop gives him food, he lets him take a bath, he gets him to shave, he gets him cleaned up. Jean Valjean is extremely bitter and desperate, so he steals 40 pieces of silver from the bishop. Now, this is obviously, we'll see where this is going, but you can pretty much tell this is a reference to Judas. So as he's fleeing, he's captured by Inspector Javert. Inspector Javert is, like I said, the main antagonist. We'll get into more about him later, but he continues to follow Jean Valjean throughout the years. He's kind of a counter to Jean Valjean as a character. Jean Valjean kind of represents just redemption and goodness, kind of untarnished by law, I suppose. Jean Valjean is just kind of like a purely good character, whereas Javert is the spirit of law, which is not a bad thing. Victor Hugo, I don't think, ever said Javert was a bad man. He just said he's kind of a tragic figure. Like I said, we'll get to that. So he gets captured and goes back to the bishop. So the bishop lies to Javert and says, I gave him the silver. Thank you for bringing him back, though, because I forgot to give him this as well. And he gives him his silver candlesticks. So the bishop tells Jean Valjean, I have paid the 40 pieces of silver for your soul. I have bought your soul for God. I basically own you now, and my wish is for you to become a better man. You have to become an honest man. You've been given a second chance in life, and you have to use your redemption to make the world a better place. And that's largely kind of the message of this entire thing, is Jean Valjean trying to gain his redemption, I suppose. And you might say, well, to a certain extent, does he really need a moral redemption, because nothing he's done is really that bad? Okay, he stole some silver, he was desperate, he stole a loaf of bread, he's desperate. Right, but you have to understand, and this is why this is Catholic, it's not necessarily even about your personal sins, it's about your nature. Redemption is about the reformation of your nature. It's about changing the way you look at the world, it's about changing your moral compass, it's about adjusting your conduct. It's about fundamentally, I guess you could say, transforming every aspect of your life. And in Catholicism, it's also about works. And you show the internal transformation by doing good things. You show your commitment through works. You gain grace through both works and through belief. So the bishop is saying, I've bought you. You purchased your soul for God. Jean Valjean breaks down and does penance and confession. He kind of has a true conversion. I assume if he wasn't, he gets baptized and confirmed. And Jean Valjean, ashamed and humbled by the bishop's kindness, resolves to redeem himself. He vows to become a better person. He rips up his yellow ticket and says that his old self is dead and his new self will live for God. Later it's very widely seen throughout the movie that Jean Valjean has become a very devout Catholic. He frequently holds a rosary. There's crucifixes and images of saints all throughout his house. He makes frequent reference to God. The faith is really what's transformed him and allowed him to live a better life. And he remains committed to his path wherever it may go. So, we go 8 years later. Jean Valjean has assumed a new identity as Monsieur Madeleine. He has become a wealthy factory owner and the mayor of the town. So he's become an upstanding member of the community. It's implied that he treats his workers better and pays them more than other people. He uses his wealth and position in the community to try to help the poor. And he has largely kept his promise. He's become a productive member of society. So we enter Fontaine. Fontaine is a woman of exceptional beauty whose husband basically got her pregnant and fled, and she has to live with the shame of being a single mother. And this kind of points to some of the hypocrisy of the time, because there's all these like horrible, terrible people who judge her for being a single mother, but they're malicious, awful people. So that's kind of part of it. So the other people at her work are jealous of her beauty and her long hair, so they continue to kind of harass her. The foreman of the factory wants to sleep with her, and he basically says, if you don't sleep with me, you lose your job. And she refuses to. On one day, a coworker steals a letter from Fontaine's daughter. She's paying a landlord and his wife to take care of her daughter, and one of the other women steals the letter from her. And reveals to the other workers that Fontaine is the child, and Fontaine gets into a fight. Jean Valjean comes by, and he breaks up the fight, and he tells the foreman to be compassionate and forgiving, but to just resolve. Now, to be fair to Jean Valjean, he really didn't have much of a way of knowing what exactly was going on. He was maybe a bit disinterested, but oh well. So Fontaine has to become a prostitute in order to... she becomes a prostitute in order to pay for her child and for her life. So she sells her hair, she sells her teeth, which is pretty traumatic. Let's see here. When she fights back against an abusive customer, Javert, who is now a police inspector general, so he's one of the highest ranked policemen in France, arrives and arrests Fontaine for prostitution. Once again, you have the hypocrisy of the time. You have a woman who's basically forced into prostitution by being destitute, who's getting beat up by a customer, and she's the one who gets punished. Maybe I sound like an SJW, but fair is fair. So Jean Valjean passes by the scene and pities Fontaine, and he realizes that she once worked for him and that she blames him for the misfortune. He's guilt-stricken. He pays her bail and takes her to a hospital. Soon afterwards, Jean Valjean rescues a man who was pinned by a runaway cart using his immense strength. Javert, who up till now has not recognized Jean Valjean, does recognize him and realizes he's the man he's pursued as a fugitive for all these years. He becomes suspicious, remembering how strong Jean Valjean was. It turns out, though, that another man had been arrested and is about to go on trial for breaking parole, and they believe that he was Jean Valjean. So the real Jean Valjean realizes that he can't, that this case of mistaken identity could set him free forever. The police will arrest the other guy. He'll go to jail in his place, and he can live the rest of his life free. But he is resolved to become a better man. And now he's facing the trouble. He can keep his position, which will allow him to do a lot of good, but at the same time, he feels he'll be condemning himself. So he ultimately has a song where he sings about it. So he shows up and confesses his identity to the court, and then flees. At the hospital, a delirious Fontaine dreams of her daughter Cosette. Fontaine is kind of implied to be the woman who would have been the love of Jean Valjean's life had they actually been able to be together, and they finally are together at the end of the movie, but we'll get into that. So Fontaine dies. So Javert takes Jean Valjean into custody. Valjean asked Javert for time to fetch Cosette. He said, look, let me just fetch Cosette. I'll give her my considerable fortune. I'll put her up with someone who will actually love her, and then you can take me to jail. Javert refuses, insisting that a criminal like Valjean can never change or do good. So up till now, all we've really thought of Javert is that he's kind of an asshole. He's obsessed with applying the law. He just applies it. Even though Jean Valjean isn't really a danger to society, he's obsessed with chasing him down. He arrests people if they commit any small infractions. He doesn't really have any compassion. On the other hand, though, it should be noted that Javert, regardless of how powerful or rich or poor the person is, he arrests anyone who commits a crime. He's completely impartial in his enforcement of justice. So can you blame him for trying to be honest and doing his job, or do you blame the people in power who put decent men like Javert in that case? Javert's flaw is being overly devoted to law, but we find out why in this scene. Basically, during this scene, we have a really cool song called "The Confrontation," um, and Jean Valjean basically mocks Javert and says he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and says that Javert has no understanding of what it's like to be poor, and then Javert responds by going, "You know nothing of Javert. I was born inside a jail. I was born with scum like you. I am from the gutter too." So it's revealed that Javert was born of the lowest caste in French society. In some versions, he's the son of a galley slave and a prostitute. But he worked his way up. He became a police officer. He became an inspector general, and now he's a man of great power and influence. And he did it by playing by the rules. He did it by following the law. And he has a religious devotion to the law. Javert is also a devout Catholic, but he takes a very different view. He views God's justice as being more important than his love, which makes sense because you have to understand in Javert's case, he views the flaws of the world as people not following the law. And you can see that. He would say, okay, the foreman had no right to fire Fontaine because she hadn't done anything, as opposed to Jean Valjean, who might say he had no right to fire her out of compassion. So I think you have to keep that in mind with Javert. He has very good reasons for believing what he does, and he is an impartial man who roots out corruption wherever he finds it. He just doesn't have any real compassion, or he's repressed it so he can be a better policeman. So yeah, so they have the confrontation. So we go to a different town where Cosette is staying with the innkeepers. I'll just call them the I don't know what I'll call them. I'll just call them the innkeepers because I can't pronounce the French woman. So it turns out that they're using Cosette as a slave, extorting money from Fontaine by claiming that Cosette is ill and being spoiled. They use all the money from Fontaine to spoil their own daughter, Epone. It should be noted, though, that they also neglect her. They give her money and stuff, but they don't really raise her. Cosette dreams of a life where she is not forced to work and is treated lovingly. We find out that the innkeepers cheat on their customers and live a life of criminal depravity. If you've heard the song Master of the House. Watering down the wine, making up the weight, picking up the knickknacks when they don't see straight. Everybody loves the landlord, everybody's bosom friend. I do whatever pleases Jesus, I'll skin him in the end. Yeah, basically. So, let's see here. So, Jean Valjean meets Cosette while she's on an errand drawing water and offers the innkeepers money to adopt her. The innkeepers feign concern over Cosette and cry. Jean Valjean pays them the immense sum of 1,500 francs in the end, and they leave for Paris collectively. So we cut to 9 years later. Jean Valjean is living as a wealthy gentleman in Paris with Cosette as his adopted daughter. Cosette has grown into a very beautiful, gentle, and feminine young woman. And what happens in 1832 is there's the death of General Lamarck, who's seen as the only man who shows mercy to the poor. I think he was an ex-revolutionary who became part of the government and was kind of in charge of welfare. I'm not exactly sure. But we see those rallying in the streets, a group of 3 revolutionaries. The only ones who really matter are Marius and Enroles? I can't pronounce it. Whatever. I'll just call him the leader of the rebellion, who contemplates the effect that the death of the general will have on the poor and desperate in Paris. The innkeepers have lost their inn as Javert shut them down for being corrupt, and they now run a street gang. Their daughter, who's grown, has fallen in love with Marius, who's oblivious to her affections. And let's see here. The innkeepers prepare to con some visitors who have come to give alms to the poor who turn out to be Jean Valjean and Cosette. Cosette is grown into a very beautiful young woman, and while the gang tries to rip off her father, Cosette runs into Marius, and the pair fall in love at first sight. Let's see here. The innkeeper suddenly recognizes Jean Valjean, but before they can finish robbing him, Javert, who is now an inspector stationed in Paris, comes to the rescue and saves Jean Valjean and Cosette from the street gang, because he's trying to track down street gangs who are stealing people's money. Once again, I just say this to point out that Javert is not exactly a bad guy. True, he's chasing Jean Valjean over time, but Jean Valjean is technically a criminal. And that's what the law is at this part. So we have one of my favorite songs about now, which is Stars. Maybe I should do a rendition of Stars sometime. But basically, you know what? Why not? Stars shining in multitudes, scarce to be counted, fallen from grace, fallen from God, a fugitive running. Let's see here. But basically, he talks about the stars as being a metaphor for his trust in God, because he believes that the universe is just and ordered, and where there is suffering suffering is a punishment of sin. So basically, he says just the stars are constant. They always are in the same place in the sky. They come each season, and because of that, the universe is just and ordered, and he sees himself as an enforcement of God's order on the universe. So he takes a vow on the stars, and thus to God, that he will find Jean Valjean and recapture him. Meanwhile, Marius persuades Epone to help him find Cosette. So the students have come up with these idealistic ideas to prepare for a revolution. They're interrupted, though, by Marius fantasizing about his love. And eventually they bring the news that the general has died. And then they have a series of songs, Do You Hear the People Sing and Red and Black, talking about the rising of discontent in France, and how if they start an uprising, then it will snowball and it will eventually overthrow the July monarchy, and they'll have a republic again. So let's see here. So Epone leads Marius to Jean Valjean's house, despite being heartbroken that her love has fallen in love with another. So he and Cosette meet again and get engaged. Let's see here. So we have let's see here. Something happens. Valjean thinks that Javert has come from him, and he tells Cosette that it's time for them to go on the run. So on the eve of the Paris uprising of 1832, Jean Valjean prepares to go into exile. Colette and Marius are in despair over being parted after just finding true love. The leader of the revolutionaries encourages all of Paris to join in the uprising as he and the other students prepare for battle. Marius is conflicted over whether to join Cosette or join the uprising. Javert reveals that he has been chosen to spy on the students, and the innkeepers talk about how they're going to profit off the coming violence. Marius decides to stand with his friends and anticipate what dawn will bring. And we're going to cut to note one day more here. If it sounds weird other than just the fact I sing like shit, what I did was I found a song that had a karaoke and a normal version, and I took the karaoke version and I mixed it with just a track of me singing. I sang along and recorded myself singing to the normal version so I could get the timings right. It just doesn't sound very good, but let's cut to it. One day more, another day, another destiny, on this never-ending road to Calvary. These men who seem to know my crime will surely come a second time one day more. I did not live until today. How can I live when we are parted? Day more. Tomorrow will be miles away. And yet with you my world has started. One more day all on my own. Will we ever meet again? One more day with him not caring. I was born to be with you. What a life I might have known. And I swear I will be true. But he never saw me then. One more day before the storm. Do I follow where she goes? At the barricades of freedom. Do I join my brothers there as our ranks begin to fall? Do I stay? Do I dare? Will you take your place with me? The time is now. The day is here. One day more. One more day to revolution. We will nip it in the bud. We'll be ready for these schoolboys. They will wet themselves with blood. Watch them run amok. Catch them as they fall. Never know your luck when there's a free-for-all. They're a little pinch. They're a little touch. Most of them are gonna, so they won't miss much. One day to a new beginning. Raise the banner of freedom high. Every man will be a king. Every man will be a king. There's a new will for the winning. There's a new will to be won. Do you hear the people sing? My place is here. My fight with you. Day more. Tomorrow will be far away. Tomorrow is the judgment day. Tomorrow we'll discover what our God in heaven has in store. One more dawn. One more day. One day more. So, back to Act 2. As the students build a barricade that will serve as their rally point against the government, Javert, disguised as a rebel, volunteers to spy on the government troops. Marius discovers that Epone has disguised herself as a boy to join the rebels and sends her to deliver a farewell letter to Cosette. Jean Valjean intercepts the letter and learns about Marius and Cosette's romance. Jean Valjean, being a man who loves his daughter above everything else, decides to go and join the revolt, sending Cosette away to try and keep Marius safe. Epona walks the streets of Paris alone, lamenting that her love will never be reciprocated. So the French army arrives and demands the students surrender, telling them that that no one has joined their uprising. Javert tells the students that the governments will not attack that night, when they obviously will. He's exposed for a spy, though, and the students detain him. They intend to execute him, but Jean Valjean shows up and asks to be given the honor of killing Javert because of the way Javert has hunted him through the years. Jean Valjean, though, succeeds at merely frees Javert instead, and says, "I hold no animosity to you. You have done your duty, nothing more." Acknowledging that Javert is also necessary in society as well as him, and saying that Javert, he doesn't feel ever acted out of maliciousness or evil, just a misguided positive impulse in the law. So he leaves Javert. However, Javert is unable to square he's unable to square the circle that Jean Valjean is a criminal, but also a good and decent man who's capable of mercy. And so he ponders it, and I'm actually going to sing this song because I love this song. Who is this man? What sort of... Oh, no, okay, sorry. Who is this man? What sort of devil is he? To have me caught in a trap and choose to let me go free. It was his hour at last to put a seal on my fate. Wipe out the past and watch me clean off the slate. All it would take was a flick of his knife. Vengeance was his and he gave me back my life. Damned if I'll live in the debt of a thief. Damned if I live him yield at the end of the chase. I am the law, and the law is not mocked. I'll spit his pity right back in his face. There is nothing on earth that we share. It is either Valjean or Javert. How now can I now allow this man to hold dominion over me? This desperate man who I have hunted, he gave me my life, he gave me freedom. I should have perished by his hand. It was his right, it was my right to die as well. Instead I live, but live in hell. And my thoughts fly apart. Can this man be believed? Shall his sins be forgiven? Shall his crimes be reprieved? And must I now begin to doubt? Who never doubted all these years? My heart is stone, and still it trembles. The world I have known is lost in shadow. Is he from heaven or from hell? And does he know that granting me my life today, this man has killed me even so? I am reaching, but I fall, and the stars are black and cold as I stare into the void of a world that cannot hold. I'll escape now from that world, from the world of Jean Valjean. There is nowhere I can turn, there is nowhere to go on. So, in other words, Javert commits suicide because he can't solve the equation, which kind of completes his quest as a tragic hero. And I say hero because he is a decent man. Jean Valjean also had actually agreed to go back and go back to prison if he survived the night, which he doesn't. He does actually, though, offer his life to God if Marius can be freed, because his daughter still has a chance of a good life free from that. So the rebels realize that the people of Paris have not risen up with them, but they propose to fight on anyways. Epone jumps in front of a bullet and saves Marius's life in exchange, and dies alone and dejected, realizing that Marius will never love her the same way. So she dies. The army gives the final warning, but the army charges and succeeds in taking the barricade. Everyone is killed except for Valjean and the gravely wounded Marius, who escape into the sewers. The innkeepers begin looting and take an immense amount of cash off of them, and they will eventually become nobles afterwards by buying titles. Let's see here. Valjean brings Marius to a doctor who survives. I'll read what it says here. Javert finds himself unable to reconcile Valjean's merciful acts with his conception of Valjean as an irredeemable criminal. Refusing to compromise his principles, but no longer able to hold them sacred, he finds himself torn between his faith in God and his faith in the law, and commits suicide. In the wake of the failed revolution, people mourn the deaths of the so many students who died. Cosette comforts Marius and they get married. Valjean realizes that Cosette will no longer need him as a caretaker when she's married, and gives him their blessing. Valjean confesses to Marius that he is escaped convict and must go away because his presence endangers Cosette. Marius promises never to tell Cosette that Valjean is a criminal. So let's see here. The innkeepers. Let's see here. Marius realizes that Valjean was the one who saved his life, and he can't let Valjean die without saying thank you to him. Cosette finds out about his past as a criminal and forgives him for his sins. They both want to see Valjean and tell them of their forgiving and their eternal love for him before he dies. Valjean decides to spend the remainder of his life at a convent, praying and waiting to at last find the peace he couldn't find in life. As he is dying from old age and a lifetime of running and stress, the spirit of Fontaine appears before him and tells him that he has been forgiven and he has redeemed himself from all of the bad things he's done throughout his life. Fontaine appears in the form of, I guess you could say, an angel, although angels aren't dead people. And God appears in the form of the bishop from earlier, welcoming Jean Valjean home and telling him that yes, he has redeemed himself and he did indeed become a better man. On his deathbed, Cosette and Marius arrive to find Jean Valjean. Valjean thanks God for letting him live long enough to see his daughter and son once again. Valjean gives Cosette a letter confessing to his troubled past and telling her the truth about her mother. As he dies, the spirits of Fontaine and Epone guide him to heaven, reminding him that to love another person is to see the face of God. There they join with the spirits of those who die in the barricades, and we have a final reprise of Do You Hear the People Sing, showing that in heaven, in a world governed by God, all tyranny and oppression have vanished. Sorry, I get choked up at the end of this musical. So I guess the ultimate message at the end is only God can bring about paradise on earth, and only God can ultimately bring justice. Les Miserables, at least the Miracle and movie, are a tribute to the Christian idea of redemption. Specifically the Catholic idea of becoming a better man through making changes to your life and doing actions as well as having faith. The film is about and the musical is about the transformation of Jean Valjean from a flawed and broken person to a man full of faith and purpose. Through his strong belief, he's able to make amends and right a great many number of wrongs and really become more successful than he could ever be in absence of his faith. We also see other concepts of good, be it Cosette's kind of gentle but less active purity, or Javert's blind devotion to the law. Ultimately, though, I suppose you could call Les Miserables a bittersweet tragedy. Well, it ultimately affirms that we will all be with God in the end, and all debts black and white will be paid on the last day, or when we die in friendship with the Lord. At the same time, that life is hard and unfair, and that we often have to make very difficult challenges, often choosing between doing the right thing and following the law, that they aren't always identical. So I highly recommend the movie. I know a lot of people don't like Russell Crowe's singing. I think he did a good job of Javert's singing aside. I thought the movie was pretty good. Definitely watch the musical though. Especially the 25th one with what's his name, Norm Lewis as Javert. Okay, people are going to go Argent, but he's black. Okay, he may be black and it may be casting, but Norm Lewis is a truly amazing singer. He's perfect as Javert. 10th anniversary performance is also great. You can find both on YouTube. Sorry this went long, but there's a lot to cover and I could talk about this for hours more. God bless everyone. I hope you enjoyed this, and let's work on that next 1,000 subscribers.